Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me and everything is okay with connection. Welcome to this new webinar by the International Energy Agency. I'm happy to be with you again today to continue our discussion on energy modeling. Today we will look further into the power sector, and I'm sure that this will be a topic of interest for many of you looking at the organization you are working with, because I think many of you deal with electricity, but I also hope that for others, like for all the other participants who work from other sectors, this will be an interesting webinar because it addresses a very complex topic, which is power, and it focus on how this topic is handled by policymakers and how they can anticipate future demand for electricity and plan accordingly the development of supply resources. Because where power is a very complicated energy that you need like all the time supply matching demand. So we'll discuss that in details. We'll see the role of the different sources of power, and we will finish with the inclusion of variable renewable sources such as solar PV and wind. So just reminding you where we are. So this week is the third. So this is the second week in which we address modeling directly, and this is the third lecture, which, as I introduced, will be focused on the power sector. As for previous events, feel free to ask any question in the Q&A box and to raise your hand, or subsequently to send emails to me or to the relevant colleagues. But it's enough to send it to me or to the Africa program email, so that I can also forward it to our colleagues, which present specific topics within all the lectures. So I will just start with sharing with you a few considerations and findings on the power sector, just to insist on why power sector is so important. And so we are looking at this sector because it's key to our energy system. So if you look in the world, the share of the electricity and heat, but let's focus mostly on electricity in the demand for energy by end-use sector is important. You can see it. You have more than 20% of energy demand for end use that come from power, and it's way more in the residential sector. It's also in the service sector, and as a consequence, you will also see that power is considerable for 40% of CO2 emissions, and this is the picture for the world. But when we look at Africa, we have the same trend, the same, let's say, orders of magnitude, even though in the residential sector, power only accounts for approximately 5% of the energy demanded, because as you know very well, bioenergy and traditional use of biomass is still the first fuel in the residential needs in Africa. So this is some global pictures. Let's have a look at maybe some very recent trends in the power sector. If we look at electricity consumption per big region, so you have, for example, here depicted in red China and in yellow Africa, you will see that in 2019, this is the level of electricity demand that was at a certain level. And if we look at what happened between 2019 and 2020, you will see that this 2020, so this year impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Sorry, I see there is a, could you minimize your screen photo? Okay, sorry. Okay, I don't know. You should be able to see the, I don't know, I will try, sorry, I will try to stop the sharing and do it again. Okay. Is it okay now?
I think it's okay. It's the
Okay.
person who in your
Okay. Maybe.
for
Okay.
the person who asked the question. I think for Sebastian, on your right side up, you have the view, and you can choose how you want to view,
Yeah.
and you should put either standard view
Yeah.
and
You're right.
or
Probably
swap
it
the
was.
video and the shared screen. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Zakia. Okay, so I was saying that like in 2020, we see the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and all these restrictions and the consequences of measures like lockdowns. You would see that electricity demand has been relatively resilient to the shock that this year experienced, because much less than other fuels such as, for example, oil or coal, electricity demand has declined by only 2% across the year, whereas the total decline was approximately 5% in final energy demand. And if you look at some regions, like, for example, China, actually there has been no decrease, but there has been an increase in electricity demand between those 2 years, like so between 2019 and 2020. On the contrary, for all the other region, there has been a slow, even really limited reduction in electricity demand between 2019 and 2020. So this is, let's say, the recent evolution. But what could the future look like? Well, in all the scenarios developed by us, by the IEA, we see electricity demand returning to grow very fast. And from the early 2020s, and really, like, we really expect electricity to play a more central role in meeting energy needs and outpacing demand for growth for any other fuel. So let's look. So you have seen how electricity has evolved from 2030 to 2040. We would expect that China would lead the growth with the demand doubling by like between 2020 and 2040. We could also see that the doubling of electricity demand in Africa, that that we have other sorry, okay. So yeah, Africa doubled. We have also other interesting trends. You can see how India, for example, um, based on our analysis, would take over the European Union as the third largest power system before 2040. And when we try to think of the source of demand growth, we see that the face of demand for electricity is changing. So, of course, we will have some traditional sources of demand, like electric motors, for example, in industry, or, for example, household appliances. And especially in developing and emerging countries, there will be a lot of industrial development, as well as a high level of incomes that we expect will move move from the usage from traditional sources of demand to fuel, for example, to the growth of electricity. But there are also other trends that will drive this growth. For example, digitalization and electrification of the transport, but also the cooling sector that we anticipate will be very relevant. If you remember, we modeled it in the introduction to modeling webinar, the first I did with you. Okay, so an important point is the solar PV becoming the new king of electricity. So now this means that we are looking at the supply side. So we also expect to witness a profound transformation on the way electricity is produced. So if we look at what happened over the last two decades, you can see that the change in global electricity generation between 2000 and 2019, you could see that coal was the #1 source, and this is what we call we used to call the reign of coal. But things are changing because if we look, we think that like they're already changing the paradigm is already changing, because if we look at the most recent years, solar PV has already become to the first source and the most dynamic source. So basically the most built power technology over the past 3 years, for example. So here you can see the trend for these new years. So as I anticipated you also during the introductory lecture, our goal is to look ahead. So here you have the results for our stated policy scenario, so the steps scenario, and you can see we could expect coal-fired electricity generation to decrease by 2040. So you can see that coal as a negative bar. But on the contrary, we expect a growth for gas and a very, very strong growth for wind and solar PV. And this is why we now call PV the new king of electricity. But there is also even more potential because the second scenario, if you remember the sustainable development scenario, we expect solar PV to produce 8,000 terawatt hour more electricity than today. So this is like 12 times what was produced by solar PV in 2019, and this is really like the most important point to be raised here. And here you can see the difference. You can see how coal, because of the implication and the assumption in the sustainable development scenario, is completely phased out to like not necessarily completely, but is on the path of being phased out on looking at the period 2019-2040. So these were global trends. When it comes to Africa, okay, no, did I change? Okay. So when it comes to Africa, we have to ask ourselves if this investment, so this level of investment, so this transformation will require a very high level of investments. So here you can see how in 2018 you had approximately $40 billion like yearly, so average annual power sector investment in Africa. Here you can see the needs for those two scenarios I introduced you, and both scenarios, so both all these annual average investments are divided by the investment needed in the generation, so in the supply part, and in the electricity network, so in the transportation and distribution of the electricity. So as you can see, jumping from 2018 to the stated policy scenario, we have a double in the annual average investment required. Here we are just talking about Africa. And in the Africa case, which is the third scenario I proposed you in the previous lectures, which is aligned with the Agenda 2063 from the African Commission, you can see how this is 4 times the investments we have right now, we had in 2018. This is the fragmentation by country, so you can see how this is geographically like each area has specific levels of investment required. So the idea now, the question is that feasible? So do we have money for that? And what we have done is to compare this level of required investment with the original GDP. And in our Africa case, this would mean putting on the table a bit more than 2 or 2.5 of the GDP in the power sector. And this we consider to be reasonable. And on a second, let's say, from a second point of view, we have observed in the past that this is less than, for example, India has done over the past 2 decades, and similar to what China has also accomplished over the same period. So we think that mobilizing investment in Africa is challenging. We all know that, but we think that this is achievable, and this will bring many benefits, such as universal access to electricity, and especially a more vitalized and dynamic economy in general, but like with more reliable and more supplied electricity sector, we think that there is the possibility of driving the continent growth. So these were a few findings. So now I wanted to share with you some other questions from the Mentimeter tool. So I will invite you to go on www.menti.com as usual. I will share the questions, and I will also share in the Q&A, sorry, in the chat, the link and the code to use. We have for now 2 questions. Okay, so I think you should be able to see the question. Feel free to write if something doesn't work. So the first question is, which is the largest electricity electricity producing source in Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa in 2019? So which was actually the largest electricity producing source in the continent, excluding the upper Saharan part. So we are just talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, and we exclude South Africa, being it an outlier when we talk about, especially when we talk about electricity production. So you have gas, you have hydroelectricity, you have coal, you have oil, you have wind, we have solar PV, geothermal, and bioenergy. Remember, I'm asking you for electricity. Okay, so there are 4 answers. Okay, yeah, I see. I see that just 5 of you were able to answer. So, okay, I see there is another question. Please share the code. Yeah, the code is in the chat. Most them. Sorry. Okay, sorry. My bad, everyone. Okay, this is the code. Okay. Okay, yeah, I will continue. Yeah, as you anticipated, the largest electricity producing source in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2019 was actually hydroelectricity. I will call like the reason we usually also exclude South Africa from this kind of analysis is exactly because South Africa is a country which is heavily relying on coal. And if we had to include coal So South Africa in this analysis, hydro would still be the first one, but coal would be would had an higher share, because if you go and see analysis on South Africa, you will see how they are reliant on coal power production, especially for electricity. Okay. Okay. So the second question is, which source of electricity has increased the most? So we are talking just about generation since 2014 in Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. Okay, so this is a bit of a tricky question, because the growth rate of technology trends, like technology, depends on the starting point. And in the case, for example, of other technologies which were already, let's say, well established, this clearly affects, let's say, or decreases the possibility for relative increase. So on the contrary, for example, solar PV, solar PV and wind, which are more recent and new, so their growth rate to be very high compared to the other sources. So in this case, the correct answer was actually wind, because it was the #1 fastest growing source of electricity between 2010 and 2019. Again, starting for a very, very low starting point, it has increased basically by 50 megawatt per year. So, okay. Now I will stop here. These questions will be we will do them later during the presentation. So now I will just share again. Okay. So the agenda for today. So at the end of today's webinar, you will know more about power systems. We will discuss the basics of power systems so that you understand really the general principle. So how to have these electricity balances, for example, understanding how to add capacity, and then how to dispatch. So how to decide when to use a certain power plant and when to use another one. So this will be the first part, and I will now leave the floor to my colleague Yasmin, which will drive you through these topics. So just 1 second, I will share the screen and leave you to Jasmine's presentation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session dedicated to the power sector. My name is Yasmin Arsalan. I'm a power sector modeler and analyst within the World Energy Outlook team here at the IEA. So today, together, we'll look at the basic principle and characteristic the power. Together, we'll look at the basic principle and characteristic of the power. operation. As we all know, power systems are very complex systems. They have a multitude of actors, multitude of elements and interaction between them. I'd like to focus on the most important one here. So first, the demands.
Sorry, it seems that we have a problem with the video sharing. Just give me 1 second. Sorry. Okay, sorry. I think I solved the problem. Just give me a second.
I'm a power sector modeler and
Yes, it works
analyst
now.
within the World Energy Outlook team here at the IEA. So today, together, we'll look at the basic principle and characteristic of the power sector. We will first have a look at how it's functioning without wind and solar PV. Then at the end of the presentation, we'll come back to these newer technologies and see how they are impacting the power system's operation. As we all know, power systems are very complex systems. They have a multitude of actors, multitude of elements and interaction between them. I'd like to focus on the most important one here. So first, the demand side of things. You can see here the different centers where electricity is consumed, be it a household, be it industries and businesses, commercial facilities. Second, then on the supply side of things, where this electricity is produced. So this is the generation facilities. And third, between those two groups, you have the grid, transmission, distribution grids, and other related infrastructure, and the grid that connects those two broad groups. So this is for the grid connected element of power systems. You have, in addition, some off-grid elements. They can be divided between mini-grids and standalone system. We need now to remember that this is a picture taken at one point in time. For example, regarding the national grids, traditionally, this has been only one direction flows from generation centers to demand centers. And now this traditional way at looking at flows is becoming blurrier and blurrier. You can see that now more and more consumers are generating their own electricity and injecting it into the grid. So this traditional unidirectional flow is becoming more multidirectional. So that is on the national grid side. On the off-grid side, we can think that some off-grid elements can at some point be integrated in the national grids. Mini grids can be connected at some point in time to the main grids. So this presentation, we will look mainly to on-grid system, and we will leave the off-grid ones to a separate webinar. Today, we will focus mainly at the supply side of things. We will focus really at the generation part of the power sectors. Of course, demand side is really important. Electricity demand level, electricity demand shape will really impact the power sector's operation and their evolution over time. over the course of the year, over the course of a month, over the course even of a day, or even at a shorter time frame, will have impacts on the operation of power sector generation. So more on demand. We looked yesterday at end-use sector energy demand. Electricity accounts for a very important part of it. At the global level, we are talking about 1/5 of end-use sector energy demand that are met by electricity. And if we consider that electricity has a higher conversion efficiency compared to other fuels, other energy vector, then this share of useful energy is even much, much higher. Going forward, one very important characteristic to keep in mind when we are talking about electricity is that it cannot be stored in large quantities or for very long periods of time. We have some exception, thinking about large hydro storage facilities, for example. But the point is that it's very different from other energy commodities such as oil, such as gas, such as coal. The consequence of that is that we need to balance the system all the time. Electricity demand must be met at all time by electricity production. And for all this variation that we see over the course of the year or at even the second time frame. Until here, we looked at electricity demand. So this is sitting at this part of the world energy model. Need to be balanced at all time, but by the electricity supply. So this is considered as an input to the power supply module of the model. In some other model, where final energy model is not as a part of the whole system, this would be considered as an exogenous input. So here we have final energy demand that is endogenous and that is feeding the supply part of power system. We also have a feedback loop from the power system to final energy demand, and this is reflected through the price of electricity. So electricity prices will determine also the competition that occurs between fuels in final energy demand section of the model. So if we look at this point with a very, very simple schematic, we can see how electricity demand is different from electricity generation. In electricity generation, we account also for the grid losses, the own use of power plants, some electricity trade that can occur between countries, between region. Let's think about power pools where trade can happen. So the total generation needs to be met by the producing facilities, which determines the electricity prices. And then there is this feedback to end-use sectors' demand. Now let's move on to the next section of this power supply modeling session. So we will touch upon more in detail what are the sub-modules of the power sector module in our model. So if we have a closer look at the power sector generation module, we have inputs flowing in. We need a lot of historical data, such as capacity by technology, by year. We need information on the generation mix, the fuel consumption. On top of that, each technology has a different feature. The cost, the capex of each technology will be quite important to drive our module. We have also learning rates, which will make this cost evolve over time as we have learning by doing. We need some grid elements, such as the length of the line, and also capacity factors. On top of that, some elements are linked to projections from other modules. So, as mentioned earlier, we need electricity demand from the demand module. On top of that, fuel prices that would come from the supply module, and CO2 prices in regions that have applied these kind of policies. Talking about policies, we have constraints also. Other policies than CO2 pricing can be renewable energy targets, but other constraints can be market or non-market related or technical. And as output, we are able to derive capacity, the network length, generation, fuel consumption, cost, investment, and electricity prices that would then be implemented as a feedback loop for electricity demand module. Now let's have a closer look at this black box. When we model the power sector, we need to remember that this is a multitude of submodules that needs to be considered, from distributed generation to nuclear generation. One of these modules, for instance, combined heat and power and heat plants, will have heat demand as a driving element. Water is a driver for this desalination one. Renewables need to take into account the available potential for each location, etc., etc. And as an output of each of these very complex modules, we have the evolution of capacity, fuel mix in terms of generation and use. We have the emission, we have the investment and prices. So this is a more detailed diagram of the power sector module. Here you can see that there are two central points in this module. We have the capacity addition mechanism on the left. So this is the module from which we derive what type of capacity needs to be built to meet electricity demand. So the inputs in white of these modules are investment assumption, prices, efficiency, historical capacity, and retirement. We also have in green some calculation that would have an important impact on this module. Electricity demand, obviously, we build this capacity to meet demand. And we will look at this module first, then we will move on to the dispatch mechanism. Once we have those plants, this installed capacity, how do they operate? So maybe before digging in, an important consideration to have in mind here. When we are talking about the needed installed capacity in a power system, there are two components. We build it to meet demand, but also because our power plants have lifetime. So existing plant today will be retired in the future. And so new capacity addition will need to compensate for these retirements, and on top of that, increase to meet the new demand. So let's start with the capacity addition module. So we need first to remember a key characteristic of the power sector, which is that supply and demand must match at all times. And looking at demand, we have a constant variation over time. So here we can see the hourly electricity demand, and we can see how it changed over the year with strong variation among seasons, which would depend obviously on the country. If we could look at monthly changes, we see as well some variation. And during the week, we see higher demand during working days. And during the day, higher demand during daylight hours compared to nighttime hours. So to model power supply, hourly electricity model can be used. We have this kind of models here in the World Energy Outlook team for several regions, the United States, China, India, and the European Union. But this is quite a complex kind of modeling, and it requires a lot of data. It requires very powerful computing capabilities. So when we look at the annual granularity, we make some assumptions, some simplification to still consider the granularity, the time period granularity, but keeping it in a simpler way. A very common simplification is to reorder the hourly electricity demand from the highest point, the peak hour, to the lowest value. And this is what we call the load duration curve. It can be expressed in absolute value, or as you can see here, relative to the average electricity demand and in percentage terms. So for example, here we see that the peak is about 170% above average demand over the year. So this is how we proceed. We can divide this load curve in several homogeneous segments. And the most typical one being peak, mid, and base. So 4 periods of time here, the highest one being the peak segment, the lowest, the base load segment, and in between 2 mid-load segments. So given the evolution of electricity demand over the projection period, the evolution of total dispatchable capacity can be estimated through 2 steps. So first, the peak to average ratio. Remember this 170% above average that we saw in the previous example. So we calculate this peak to average ratio based on the analysis of historical data and the evolution of different end use, for instance, cooling needs or electric vehicles can make this demand peakier. Then to have more reliability on the system, it is not only the peak demand that needs to be met. We build the system to meet that peak demand, but we have a level of security. This is what we call the capacity margin. So an additional amount of dispatchable capacity to be sure that we have a reliable system, even if some plants for extreme reason like rupture of supply chains, etc., are down in a certain period of time, then we have this capacity margin on top of the peak demand to make sure that the system is meeting demand at all times. So coming back to the different time slices. So as we saw earlier, we considered base load type of plant, mid-load type of plant, and peak load type of plants. And for each time slice, the new additional capacity needs to take into account all these three different time slices. So we consider the net addition needed to meet new demand, and as mentioned earlier, the addition needed to replace the retiring plants. Back to the main diagram on power sector module and the two central points of power modeling. So we had a look at additions of new plants. Now we will look at the way to operate these plants once they have been added to the system. So if you look at this diagram, the main inputs to operate the plants are, of course, what is the installed capacity, which was an output, outputs are in blue, an output of the capacity mechanism. Once we have capacity, then the main drivers would be fuel and CO2 price, efficiencies, historical capacity, maximum capacity factors. And the output of this is generation by plants, and we will see at a later stage fuel consumption and CO2 emission by plant type. So we're really focusing on this part of the model. We have several dispatch mechanisms available when we model how plants operate. This is really aiming at determining which plants, which technology will generate in which point in time within the hour, within the year, given a number of constraints such as the availability and flexibility, the technical constraints of each plant type. So, given a certain level of demand and a certain amount of installed capacity, depending on the type, power plants generate electricity based on dispatching rules, usually on an hour-by-hour basis. What is important here is the utilization rate, meaning during a year, how often these plants operate. So in gray, baseload plants would operate generally with capacity factors or utilization rates around 80%. 80% of the year, baseload plants would be used to meet demand. Mid-load would be generally used 50% of the year, and peak load run very much less hours. Really, as you can see on the graph on the left, you see they're used really for peaky demand, and so they have generally much lower capacity factor, generally below 10%. Here in this example, we have 7%. So this is a very useful indicator, this capacity factor. It can be used in the modeling to add additional constraint on the maximum generation of a group of plants. For example, you could set as a constraint that gas turbine cannot be used more than X% of the year. This is used to simulate operational constraints and also grid bottlenecks. One of the most common and most efficient dispatch system is the merit order. So what is the merit order? This is an approach, a least cost approach based on variable costs. This variable cost, we look within each hour which is the best suited plant, which is the least cost plant to generate. So we rank plants from the lowest to the highest variable cost, measured here in dollars per megawatt hour, also taking into account the maximum electricity that they can generate in that hour. This diagram shows the level of electricity demand on the x-axis, and it helps determine which plants will run, and the consequence, the implication is the price. For example, for baseload plants, the off-peak price would be determined mainly by nuclear, lignite, and steam coal during baseload hour, mid-load, and also for peak load demand. When we average this resulting price over the whole 8,760 hours of a year, we can determine the average electricity wholesale price, the average annual electricity wholesale price. So why is the dispatching mechanism important? This module helps determine a number of very important elements. So how plants are operated over time, how much electricity is produced by each technology, which plants will be generating, and then, and I'll come back to that later, the fuel use and associated emission. And we saw that just in the previous slide, the price. And to sum up, the result depends on many factors. So from the capacity addition mechanism, which plants are here in the system for each year of projection, what are the relative price of coal, oil, and gas that would impact the variable cost and therefore the merit order? Is there a CO2 price that would penalize the most carbon-intensive technology? And again, the changing level of demand. A quick illustration of the result of the generation module for a very specific case that we took from our World Energy Outlook 2019, and especially the focus on Africa. So here on the top, we can see the evolving demand over the period and for different scenarios, and how electricity is generated, what are the different sources of electricity in those three scenarios, the stated policy scenario, the Africa case. So we can see clearly that in the Africa case, demand increased almost eightfold, and here gas, wind, and solar are meeting most of the demand growth. Coming back to the diagram, we have now covered the two main components, addition of new plants and dispatch mechanism. To follow, I would like to focus on other very important elements of this power system, which is how much fuel is consumed by plants and the consequence of it, the CO2 emission by plant type. So once we have electricity generated from the dispatch module, one key element to consider is the efficiency of these plants. This is really key to determine the overall efficiency of the park and therefore the fuel use by type. The fuel use by type is really important when considering domestic production, considering energy security consideration, etc., etc. So how much oil would need to be imported, how much gas is very much linked to fuel use consumption in the power system. And from generated electricity, we derive that using efficiency of plants. So over time, technical improvements and with aging plants out of the park and more efficient new plants coming in, we can see the evolution. In the OECD region, this evolution is really minimal, but as you can see in China and India, as the demand is decreasing much faster, we have much more new plants coming in to meet that demand, and these new plants are generally more efficient, having a big impact on efficiencies in the park. Once overall fossil fuel use is determined from electricity generation using efficiency, we can derive the total CO2 emissions of the power sector. As you can see in the graph, the increase of electricity generation can be balanced by a decrease of the average emission per unit of electricity generated. This can be linked to two main factors. First, each fuel has a different carbon intensity, coal being the most intensive one, whereas gas is the lowest intensive technology. So a shift from coal to gas would have an impact on the CO2 emission per electricity generated. The second main driver is the efficiency. The efficiency would limit the fuel input per electricity output. So to pursue climate goals, CO2 intensity will need to be strongly decreased thanks to the massive deployment of low carbon technology, but also thanks to a shift to lower emitting fossil fuel technology and improvement of new technology so they are more efficient.
Okay, perfect. So now we will continue with our presentation. I will go back sharing my screen that you should be now able to see. Okay, so I will stop here a few minutes. If you have questions with respect to what you just heard from my colleague Jasmine, or maybe with respect to what we have presented earlier, then I will continue with some analysis we did on Kenya, and then we will go back to the second part of the lecture from my colleague Jasmine. So feel free to raise your hand as usual, or to write your question in the Q&A box. Since I don't see any question right now, I will continue with the presentation on Kenya. But again, feel free to write them in the chat or to raise your hand so that I can give you the possibility of unmuting yourself and to have the floor. So as I said, I just wanted to show you some slides specific to Sub-Saharan Africa and specifically to Kenya. I remind you that in our previous Africa Energy Outlook, we did a specific chapter on Kenya that you can find in the, let's say, whole Africa Energy Outlook, which is available on our website. But you also have the possibility of downloading just the Kenya outlook, energy outlook 2019, which is both in English and in Swahili. And second thing, we will be releasing during this year, probably half of this year, the 2022 Africa Energy Outlook, where we will be also doing again this analysis, especially because in the middle of the two outlooks there were, let's say, important shocks, let's say, in international level, but also on the continent, especially if we think about COVID-19 and also now the conflict we are experiencing in these days. So as I said, this year you can see is the Sub-Saharan Africa electricity generation by technology. So you can see both the historical trends plus the stated policy scenario results to 2040, and the same for the Africa case to 2040. So as you can see, the mix of electricity generation in the continent, again, just to point out, here we are talking about Sub-Saharan Africa, not including South Africa, not for geopolitical reasons, but just because South Africa is really an outlier when we talk about electricity generation by technology. So here you can see that the electricity generation is right now and also in the future is dominated by the hydropower, which is the one depicted in blue, which is right now the main source of electricity generated in the continent. And you can also see that there is a quite diversified mix. Just 1 second, I see there is a question. Okay, no, it's not a question. Hi, Fatuma. So if we look ahead to 2040, we see the first thing that we can see is a strong rise in the electricity generated. But we have substantial differences between the stated policy scenario and the Africa case. In the Africa case, we have even a stronger growth in the electricity generation as a whole, but especially if we look at the technologies, like the sources, we see that gas as let's say a base load source will be a major player. And also we see a lot of solar PV, which is becoming more and more relevant in the overall mix. In this case, if we look at the Africa case, solar PV is supposed to be ranked third, probably, as a source of electricity generation. This was, as I said, a picture for Sub-Saharan Africa. Now we can look at Kenya. So under our projection, again, here you can see exactly the same. This comes from the Kenya Energy Outlook I mentioned you earlier. You can see the historical trend till 2019, which was the year in which this outlook was published. And you can see the projection for the for both our main scenarios till 2040. So you can see how geothermal, which has been dominating the electricity generation in Kenya, will be still the most relevant technology also in both our scenarios till 2040. And it's really interesting. Kenya is really an interesting let's say case with respect to this technology, and is also the reason why when I ask you in Africa which was the technology with the highest share of electricity generation, some of you answered geothermal, because really it's clearly, if you look at the entire continent, hydropower is the most important source. But clearly for Kenya, this is like each country has their own have their own peculiarities, and in your case, let's say this is okay. Should that be Kenyan case, not African case now? Yes. Aren't you? I'm reading the comment from Sebastian Waita. I think you should be able to see, yes, the Kenya electricity generation by technology chart, which is the one I was talking about right now. Tell me if there are any issue in the PowerPoint visualization. Anyway, yeah, I would be really interested to hear any feedback from you, especially with respect to when we talk about Kenya. Because as you can see, for example, I remember having a question during the last lecture last week about backup generators, which play an important role, especially on the residential in the residential sector, but also in the entrepreneurial sectors, in industry and also in agriculture. And here you can see, for example, that we also model the backup generators as electricity, so as a technology for electricity generation. And you can see how this trend is going in both our scenarios. So here, yeah, it's a small share with respect to the entire portfolio, but we also model that. And looking at the data, like not just at this graph, but downloading the data, you can see actually how we anticipate the growth of the specific technology in the future, both when talking about stated policies and also when talking about the Africa case, which I remind you is aligned with the Agenda 2063. Okay, so I will move on and just okay. So, okay. Okay, I will ask you a few other questions from Menti. So I will ask you in the meantime to go to the menti.com website so that I can ask you the last 3 questions. You should be able to see my screen right now. Tell me if this is not the case. Okay. So this question I'm asking you right now is to rank these sectors according to their electricity demand from highest to lowest for Sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa again. So you have industry, you have agriculture, you have services, you have transport, and you have residential. So just rank them according to their electricity demand from highest to lowest. So number 1 would be the sector with the highest electricity demand, and the lowest is the one with the lowest electricity demand. Okay, so yeah, we have almost a perfect picture of electricity consumption by sector. Indeed, yeah, the residential sector is number 1, but it's closely followed by industry. So it's around 75, 80 terawatt hours in 2019 for both those sectors. Then at a very lower level, we have services, which account for 40 terawatt hours. so almost half of what the residential each represent. And then really at the bottom part of this ranking, we will have agriculture and transport accounting for, like in the case of agriculture, only 4 terawatt hours. So this can be, for example, machinery equipments to process or to pump, for example, in agriculture. And then for agriculture and also in business. And then we have transport, which is ranking last in this case, with only 0.1 terawatt hour, because as of today, as you know, like the transport sector in Sub-Saharan Africa is not very much electrified. So there is a very limited demand. But there is some rising trend for electrification of transport, starting with for example, 2 or 3 wheelers, and we would expect some sales of electric vehicles to rise in the future, but so far it's still accounting for a very tiny part of the electricity demand. Clearly, this again is really country specific, so not all countries will have in the near future, we think, electric vehicles. Some will have, but again, remember that we are also really looking at long-term planning and anticipating trends till, for example, 2040. So we are talking about more or less 20 years from now. Next question. Can we expect the electrification of final use in the future to decrease, remain about the same as today, or increase? So the question here is, do you think the electricity demand will increase in the future? We are talking about final use. Do you think it will decrease, or do you think it will remain more or less the same? Yeah, I see all of you are selecting increasing. This is obviously the right answer. It was just to point out this fact. So the electrification of the final use in the future will be, it's already a big trend and really relevant trend in the at the international level, so globally, but will also be very important when talking about the African continent in the next years. So last question, I will jump to the 5th, so not this one, you already answered, sorry. Okay, this one. So what is the first characteristic that comes to your mind with respect to solar PV? We already had 2 answers, sorry, 1 answer, because actually you can give two answers, each of you can give 2 answers. So this is a completely open question. Again, I remind you that this survey is completely anonymous, so I can't see who of you, for example, in this case, wrote Sun Dependent or easily to acquire use. It's just really to have a grasp of some keywords that come to your mind when we talk about solar PV and solar energy. So just feel free to write the first things that come to your mind. Okay, so we can see, so sun dependent, intermittency. So this is really an important point, because as you already have seen a bit in the previous presentation, but you also will see better in the next one. When introducing renewable energy in the power sector, in the national power systems, the intermittency and the fact that we can't actually switch on and off the sun in this case. So really important point, the sun dependency. This is something we have to take into account when we plan for example, capacity expansion and building of new power plants, because we have to take into account this. If you remember all the reasoning my colleague Jasmine put on the table earlier during this presentation of, for example, base load and peak load generation. Okay, so I see other renewable, clearly affordable, okay. Green technology. dependent on weather. Yeah, we see again the issue of intermittency being raised. We see low marginal cost. That's also an important point, which I think also will be raised by my colleague Jasmine when we talk about the cost of electricity generation. Okay, I see 6 of you. I don't know if last ones want to add some other aspects that maybe weren't touched by the colleagues. Otherwise, I can move on. Okay, power dependency, easy to install. Okay, this is also another point. I would also add another component to easy to install, which is also related to the operation and maintenance of solar power plants. So do you think they are both easy to install and also to maintain, or is just the installation? Clearly, we are talking about absolute terms, but also relative terms. So for example, when you compare solar PV to other fossil fuel based technologies, or also other renewable sources, what do you think? What do you think about PV, solar PV, in terms of maintenance? I leave to you this question. Feel free to write the answer or some thoughts you may have in the chat or in the Q&A box. So I will move on sharing the second part of the presentation, and then we come back and we wrap up this lecture. So just a few seconds for me to share the screen with the video. Write in the chat if you see any issue when sharing my video.
So we already looked at some economic concepts when we discussed the merit order and variable costs. I'd like now to expand a little bit more on that. And so in this section, we will now touch upon some other quite important aspects of power system economics. One very important aspect is how to evaluate the competitiveness of the different electricity generating technology. So competition depends on several factors, of course, cost component, but also when the plant is used, the time of use, and where. For example, if there is a grid congestion in the specific location. And it also depends on the value side of things, the value of electricity generated, and prices, of course, which could be higher generally at peak demand time. A very common indicator that is used to estimate the cost of producing electricity is the Lcoe, the levelized cost of electricity, representing the cost of technologies over the project's lifetime. And we can see some indicative values for some of these technologies in the screen right now. The Lcoe is measured as average cost per output of electricity. So here, for example, in dollars per megawatt hours. This metric really does a great job actually at putting together all the various technology costs. So talking about the cost to develop, design, license a project, the capital cost to actually build the plant. But then, of course, over the lifetime, which can range from 20 to 70 years, you would have also to pay for operation, maintenance costs, as well as input fuel and CO2 prices when applicable. Of course, on top of that, you would have the financing cost along the way that we generally call the weighted average cost of capital. So this can be quite a significant and disparate set of costs, would depend on the technologies. And we can see here how the LCOE really does a great job at putting them together in this general formula for calculating the LCOE. We have a more simplified form as well. So the idea now is not to look in detail at this formula, but I would like to highlight one point, that we have two main components: the variable cost that we use also in the merit order, and the fixed annualized cost. And these two components, they change according to the type of plant, and also the proportion, the relative importance is different depending on the technology. One quick example here to illustrate that point is to look at LCOEs by technology in the United States for 2017. Typically, low carbon technologies such as nuclear, wind, and solar PV, they have a high fixed cost and very low variable cost. On the other hand, gas, and to a lesser extent coal, are the opposite. They have high variable cost, and compared to that, relatively lower capital cost than low carbon technologies. Another point to highlight is that financing can be quite a significant proportion, especially for capital intensive technology. And if you have to pay a rate that reflects a very high market risk, then financing can be more important than the actual cost to build the plant itself. One of limitation of the LCOE, and especially in the simplified formula, is the capacity factors that are used is often fixed. So another very useful way to look at things is to see how the cost of power plants is changing depending of the amount of time these plants are used. So in the screening curve is what we call this, this way of looking at things. In the screening curves, you would look on the y-axis as at the fixed annual cost, and it would show how the cost would increase over time, over the time of use over the year, depending on how variable costs are evolving. So this really shows different type of technology, and it's really helping us to see the least cost pathway, the least cost solution for each type of utilization, meaning at peak demand, when the numbers of operating hours are really low, up to the base load operation of power plants when they operate all the year, 8,760 hours. So you can see this least cost path in the screen right now. What is also very clear with this graph is that the power technology, they really provide different services. So we can consider nuclear power and coal plants very well suited for baseload operation, the baseload category. So it actually makes sense to compare them in terms of LCOEs. But it would be very difficult to compare a nuclear plant and a gas turbine or GT, which usually provide peak power, as we can see here. Another point is that this curve is valid only for dispatchable plants. And therefore, wind and solar PV cannot really be included. They run when the wind blows and the sun shines, so they don't really fit very well in this traditional categorization, baseload versus peaking plant technology. So the question is, for this technology, can we really compare the LCOE to dispatchable technology? So that's one of the limitation of LCOE, especially for renewable plants. So as mentioned, LCOEs are very widely used, and this is because they allow to present in one concise number the generation cost of a plant over its lifetime. There are, however, some limitations, and we really need to keep them in mind when we are using this indicator. I will focus on one of the key limitation here is it doesn't include the value of electricity generated. So basically, if you are an investor and looking at LCOE, you must keep in mind that it doesn't encompass anything on the revenue side of things. The second limitation is that making comparisons across different technology is complex or wrong. You need to go beyond and look at the screening curves as we did earlier for dispatchable technology. And this screening curve concept cannot be applied to renewables technology because of these categories between peak and baseload plants. So we really feel the need to go beyond this limitation. It does a great job, but we want to go beyond to overcome this limitation. And that's the concept that we've been developing here at the IEA with the value adjusted levelized cost of electricity. So the value adjusted LCOE is a new metric for competitiveness, and it really aims at combining costs and the value. And this is really the cornerstone of this concept, combining both. It is using information from hourly modeling of electricity demand and supply so that we can have information on how the power system operates on the hourly level, but also prices. And prices are really important to reflect the value of producing electricity in any given hour of a given year. So back to the concept of Lcoe. On the one side, you have the LCOE metric that gives you the single cost number. And on the other side, you have the system value. And we can see here 3 broad categories. And these categories are kind of mirroring the new market design that we have seen emerging in many countries, thinking about the European Union, US, Japan, but many others are looking into explicit pricing of electricity services. So the main one is energy value, which represent the value of electricity production on a system at any time to meet demand. So in wholesale markets, which are widely represented over the world, this would be reflected by bids to sell electricity in a given hour. The second category is the capacity value. So it reflects the contribution to system adequacy. Capacity market exists in a number of regions, with payment for power plants that can contribute to the reliability of the system. So basically, we can think of it that as being paid for being here when needed. And the third one is on the flexibility side, that encompass all additional services that really ensure the quality of electricity services. And this kind of services, they are generally valued through ancillary service markets that are also emerging in some countries. So the concept behind the Lcoe is taking these costs, these values, and merging them. So the energy value is the one that really has the most impact. Selling electricity is today the largest source of revenues in competitive markets. And of the three categories of values I showed earlier, this is the energy values that changes the most across technologies. So showing now some hourly outputs, with demand trends over the course of a sample day in the European Union in 2030. You can see these demand trends represented by the blue line. And you can see also the various supply technology that contribute to meeting that demand. So early in the morning, around 4 a.m., wind production is significant. And this is a time when demand is relatively low. So this leads to an excess of supply, and other plants are therefore ramping down. On the other hand, you can see also a need for a big ramp up of electricity output during the evening peak when people are getting back from work. So reflecting these changing needs over the course of the day, the market price changed quite significantly from zero price in terms of excess to higher price at peak time. So when we do that, not only for sample 24 hours, but for all 8,760 hours of a given year, we can actually derive the price received by each technology. We can then average it over the year. It can be thought at as if it was the revenues from selling 1 megawatt hour of electricity on that given year. And that's what we call the energy values. It varies across technology. Again, dispatchable technologies, and particularly the most flexible ones, they are really able to capture those high prices at peak hours. So it means that their energy values is higher than the average of the system. And this, even if they run less hours. For this particular European system, you can see as well that wind and solar, especially solar, produce when it's less needed. So in that case, they have lower energy values. That's basically the idea of the energy value for each region for which we have hourly models. So this is the United States, the European Union, China, and India. We derive from hourly operations the annual energy value for each technology. And we do this for every year projected in our outlook and for all our scenarios. So from this hourly information, we can derive also the capacity value, so the contribution to system adequacy. Can you rely on this technology to produce electricity when the system needs it the most? Dispatchable power plants are generally available in all hours, except in extreme cases such as disruption in supply chain or extreme weather, for example. And they have high capacity value. They can generally contribute to something like 80% of the peak or even above for some technologies. And for variable renewables, it would really depend on the degree of variability and how the output of solar, the output of wind is adequate and coincide with system needs. So in this example of the European Union here, we can see that their lower ability to contribute to the evening peaks would mean a lower capacity value. A quick word on the flexibility value. This is really the most difficult one to represent. In the ancillary service market in Ireland, we have more than 20 products from primary, secondary, reserves, regulation, frequency controls, and it is very difficult for a global model such as the World Energy Model to represent that kind of details. So our representation is really derived from this real world existing ancillary markets value, and we take into account how it increased with the rising share of variable renewables as it is quite obvious that this flexibility values is linked to the ramp up of these energy sources. Now, keep in mind that this is an example, and this is very specific to the European Union demand and supply pattern. It would look very differently in a system where the demand peak is more aligned to, let's say, solar output. We can think of a warm country, a sunnier country, and in that case, the peaks occurs generally at noon, and this is very well suited to solar PV, which can be able to meet cooling needs linked to this particular system. In that case, solar PV would be able to capture at the same time peak hour high prices and also to better contribute to the adequacy and have higher values. Now, how do we put all the pieces together? For a particular technology, we start with the LCOE. Then we would simulate in a given year the energy value for this technology. We do that for all technologies, so we are able to compare to the average energy value of the system. So here, for this very illustrative example, we can see that the technology has a higher value than the average of the system. So it means that it is more competitive. More competitive means that we need to adjust the cost and reduce it to reflect that. So this is what we do. We take the difference with the average energy value of the system and make this adjustment on the cost side of the metric. Now on the capacity value, the contribution to adequacy here is relatively low compared to average. So that means that the technology is less competitive than others on that specific category. Less competitive, therefore more expensive. And now the flexibility value. Again, not a very high value compared to average, less competitive. We adjust by increasing the cost side of things. So we take all these three value adjustments, we apply them to the LCOE, which leads to the value adjusted LCOE, the Lcoe. So now to summarize the Lcoe concept, it does provide a more sophisticated metric of competitiveness. It includes these elements of value that the LCOE was missing, and it makes it robust across a wider set of technology. It is not perfect. A few of these limitations includes that they are not site specific. So the network integration cost, for example, is not there. And it doesn't include externality costs that are not priced. So for example, air pollution. The Lcoe is not the only metric looking beyond the LCOEs. For example, cost and benefits aspects are already taken into account in profitability calculations, such as the net present value. We have also some academic research looking into it. The US Energy Department, they also have similar metrics. In the real world, we have some application of very similar concepts in some auctions in Mexico, for instance. So to conclude on this concept, it's really part of a bigger family of beyond LCOE metrics that aims at providing useful information for energy modeler, system planners, and investors. And talking about investors, a very important outcomes of models is the amount of investment that is needed overall in the sector and for each technology type, as well as all the related infrastructure. So beyond spending on power plants that we would derive from capacity additions and their unit capital cost, we also see here that electricity networks also need to be expanded, maintained, and digitalized. So we model this network through a dedicated module that derives transmission and distribution grids infrastructure really needed to support the expansion of the power system and also modernize existing aging assets. We have additional constraints to the model that can be added to simulate more real-life investment constraints. And there are really important policy implication, market implication that can be derived for this investment to be really happening. Otherwise, the lights would not be kept on. So this kind of really coming back to the Lcoe, so that really highlights the need for investor and policymaker to have the right signal for investments. So the Lcoe concept is really important to improve the LCOE concepts in order for them to have a clearer picture of competitiveness across technology, which is really essential to develop long-term plans and long-term goals. So I would like now to summarize the main calculation that we've been through: installed capacity, electricity generation, fuel inputs, CO2 emissions, but also kind of recall the relationships among these main elements. So we have capacity factors and merit order that are linking installed capacity and electricity generation. We have efficiency that connects electricity generation and fuel inputs. Fuel inputs and CO2 emission are related through emission factors.
Just took the opportunity to answer the question on the dispatch, but happy to go back to the recording if preferred.
Yeah, sorry, we had, I think, an issue with the connection. So I missed, were you about to answer the question as you prefer? Like you should be able to see my screen again. I hope we will not
Sure.
have again. Okay.
I'll just quickly answer it. So,
okay.
So this maybe is referring to this graph where we were seeing the different plants ordered by their variable costs. And this is actually the mechanism that is applied, for example, in European Union wholesale markets. So what you would see is that basically the gas GTs that are more costly when we look at the variable cost, this one would be the one that are called when there is a peak. Just a few minutes earlier, you saw this load curve of European Union. So think about this peak, this evening peak, where we were seeing the gas ramping up. So this is the gas that would be setting up the price when there is a peak. So this merit order is really the mechanism that is widely used in liberalized markets. Now, with the current situation with the war in Ukraine, we've seen that the gas price have been reaching historical height, historical record. So there are other mechanisms that are considered because gas is currently just a very few percent of the actual electricity supply, but it means because of this mechanism where the last plant called is the one setting the price, it means that for the European Union, we were seeing very, very high electricity prices. So there are some thinking about revising this market design to better reflect the fact that gas is not actually that important in terms of average energy. Of course, it is very important to ensure the security of supply at these peak hours, but there are some thinking about using some different pricing depending on if it is peak hour, if it is mid-load or off-peak, so that we can decouple the price of electricity to the price of gas, which has been a very problematic issue for Europe recently. So that's it for that question. I hope it answered the question. We can now probably go back to the recording.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Yasmin. Are you able to see my video, right?
Yes, absolutely.
We'll go back to that. Sorry for the inconvenience.
They really represent the biggest change and success story of the last 15 years. Solar PV is the new king. It's the most built technology over the past 3 years. It's the cheapest source of electricity in most countries over the world. And beyond these recent trends and historical trends, we see looking forward a greater role, a greater share of this technology to decarbonize power system in the future, to decarbonize the whole economy. But a point to keep in mind when we are talking about wind and solar PV is that the electricity generation, their output, is really depending on the underlying natural resources. And we can see on this slide how these outputs evolve over time because they are linked to the natural resources, they are linked to meteorological conditions. So this variation can lead to several consequences that can be summarized with really 3 main characteristics. That would be scarcity, abundancy, and variability. Scarcity is the situation that happens when these non-dispatchable renewables, these variable renewables, they do not provide enough generation to cover demand. So this requires other type of operator, other type of plant units to ramp up to meet demand. The second point, abundancy, is the opposite. It's when we have too much generation too much output from wind and solar PV in the system, which leads to excess generation compared to demand. We saw an example earlier with the European Union. Then the third category, variability, is really the extent and the speed of the change of the outputs. For instance, the speed at which solar PV ramps up for the noon peak and ramps down when the evenings come, that needs to be compensated by other means of production. The impact of variable renewable energy sources would also depend on the level of deployment. At low level of penetration in the mix, the effects are really negligible. Power systems were built already to be resilient, to be able to accommodate the variability of demand. And when solar PV and wind share is low, the variation of demand from 1 hour to another is more important, has more effect on the system than this variability coming from solar and wind PV. But when we go beyond that, we begin to see some impact. Impact on total installed capacity. One key issue is the higher flexibility needs that would be needed from the system, the higher ramping requirements. There is an impact on the load duration curve, an impact on dispatch, on prices, and consequently on market design. And finally, an impact on how the network is used, on how the network can accommodate this variability. On the impact on the load duration curves, we first need to introduce a new concept, the concept of residual load duration curve. So we can apply all the reasoning that we discussed earlier to this residual load duration curve instead of the load duration curve that we saw earlier in the presentation. So what is this residual load duration curve? We take the hourly electricity demand, so here over the month of January, and then we would need to subtract the generation of the variable renewable energy sources. Here, this is solar PV. And the result is the light blue curve, the residual demand. Then, same concept as the load duration curve, we reorder the hourly demand from the highest to the lowest. And depending on the penetration of solar PV, you can see different impact, the biggest impact being the one with 60 gigawatts of solar PV. Looking at this example of 60 gigawatt and focusing on it, we can see that it generally has a main structure, but steeper than the original load duration curve, with big differences for base load and for peak load generation. This is a peakier load duration curves that requires less base load production means. We can have a clearer view of this phenomenon in this slide, where we can see how this would impact the total firm capacity needs. They do not change significantly overall, but as mentioned earlier, peakier, more peakier needs and less baseload needs. Now, zooming in a day, a sample day, So here again, the same concept of residual demand with the total demand in red. And when we remove the solar output and the wind output, the result is the residual demand. What is really important in this zoom at the day level is we see very clearly the impact on the rest of the system. Here, when the solar output ramps up, then the rest of the system in green needs to ramp down to compensate this. And the same happens in the evening. When the solar output is coming down, then the rest of the system needs to adapt to compensate for this. And this is the basic concept behind this very famous curve. So this is showing the impact of growing variable renewable production in California. So this is the duck curve. We can see the stomach of the duck getting bigger and bigger as the share of variable renewable production in California increased. And we can see how the neck is becoming steeper and steeper, an unfortunate conjunction of decreasing output for solar, but this is also combined with a peakier demand with evening peak. So now that we have a bit described this impact, how can we really put a quantification on this impact? First, a very concrete way of measuring it is, in case of excess, the amount of curtailment that is needed. And the impact would be also the number of hours with the near zero price, which we saw also earlier in the case of EU. One implication of this is that it would decrease the attractiveness in new projects. So if we don't tackle the integration projects, new renewable projects would be less and less attractive to investors. And in that case, this would compromise the pace of change, it would compromise the pace of energy transition. So we need to avoid or at least limit the extent of this implication. And the good news is that we have several integration measures that are available to policymakers, to policy planners, and for markets. We can summarize this in increasing the flexibility of the power system, energy storage, demand-side management, as well as interconnection between demand areas, between countries, between regions, and the role of that would play network transmission and distribution grids. So these four categories, I'll come back to this in the next slide. You can see how these four main categories here displayed in that graph with different colors. For example, flexible generation solution is in blue. So we can see how these categories, they fit in the general flexibility landscape with decentralized options, the decentralized solution at the bottom, and utility scale solution on top. And these options, they are ranging from very, very short-term flexibility within the minute or even a second time frame. So this short-term is on the left, for which we can see, for example, storage that is quite well suited, and very long-term arbitrage, seasonal arbitrage, where, for example, grids would play a role, and flexible generation is a bit everywhere in this landscape. So we have seen that we have flexibility needs at the second time frame, at the seasonal time frame. One way of measuring flexibility needs can be also at the hourly level, and specifically the hour-to-hour ramping needs to fully integrate wind and solar PV and respond to change in demand. So here you can see those needs in 2019 in 4 major regions. Each dot here is representing an hour of the year. So for example, across the entire European Union, we can see that a very large upward change in dispatchable output from 1 hour to the next was needed, and about 20%. This happened when demand was rising and both solar and wind power were declining. So this is today, but in the future, flexibility needs will be much, much higher. The changing shape of electricity demand and the strong growth of solar PV and wind power, together, there are increasing flexibility needs in power systems around the world. So average hour-to-hour ramping needs almost double across most major power systems to 2040, with very much higher increase in some systems. We see a striking trend for India, where in certain hours, we will see the need for dispatchable sources to ramp up or down by well over 50%. The good news is we have those flexibility sources that I talked about earlier: power plants to electricity network, storage technology, demand side response measure. So coal and gas-fired power plants are today the main source of flexibility, and they remain so in the future. There are also some contribution from low carbon sources like hydro and nuclear power. But looking ahead, many power systems will need to rely on other means. Storage and demand side response will play a central role in flexibility, provided that we have the right policies and regulation to make this happen. And of course, on top of all these sources are grids. So solutions exist. They have a different range of impact, and the optimal mix of this solution would depend really on the characteristic of each power system.
Okay, perfect. Again, sorry for the inconvenience, but I think my Wi-Fi has some issues. So we can move to the Q&A section. You already met Yasmin, which joined us. So feel free to ask whatever question you have in the Q&A box, or raise your hand and I can give you the floor. Just a question from Sebastian. Yasmin, you have in the Q&A box, which is asking if we have any such graph for Africa. I leave you the floor.
Yes, thank you, Sebastian, for your question. So depending on which graphs, if we're talking about the last few graphs we've seen on flexibility, then we can have an estimation. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is the hour-to-hour flexibility needs, and we don't have an hourly modeling for African countries for the moment. We only have them for the European Union, for China, for India, and for the United States. However, we are able from historical data to use some proxies. So we make some estimation based on annual average, on historical load curves when they are available. We also have historical supply curves for variable renewables such as solar PV and wind. This is more and more available, and not continental wide, but for a lot of countries we are able to derive this, and then from the annual modeling we can estimate how it would behave at the hourly, but this would
Okay, any other question?
We don't hear you, darling.
Sorry, my bad. I was saying that I don't see any other question in the Q&A box, whether it's a raised hand. So sorry again for the delay and the issues, but these years have been like that with these online webinars. So if you have other questions that maybe can arise during the rewatching of today's lecture or looking at the slides and doing the exercise, feel free to write us, but you can write to me and then I can forward to my colleagues. So thank you again for being with us today for this power sector modeling lecture, and see you on Thursday when we will see the hydrocarbon modeling lecture. Thank you, Yasmin, for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all, and have a nice day.